podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a book talk by Simon Miles, Assistant Professor in the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Miles is the author of Engaging the Evil Empire, Washington, Moscow, and the Beginnings of the End of the Cold War. In this book, Miles asserts that the beginnings of the thaw-in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, usually attributed to the relationship between Reagan and Gorbachev, actually had its roots in the period of 1980 to 1985, under previous Soviet leaders such as Yuri Andropov and Leonid Brezhnev. Miles talks about the effort on the part of both the Soviets and the United States to find opportunities for meaningful diplomatic interaction that laid the groundwork for thawing, even at a time when the Cold War was at its height. The book talk is moderated by Professor William N. Bowden, Executive Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas Austin, and coincidentally, the supervisor of Miles' dissertation research. Let's listen in.
This is particularly exciting and gratifying for me to be able to be leading this discussion with Simon, not just because this is an incredible book, and let me hold it up and encourage all of you to buy your own copies. Don't wait for it to show up at the library, available at an affordable price on Amazon. But as some of you know, I had the honor really of being present at the creation for a lot of this, since I was one of Simon's dissertation committee members during his graduate study here at the University of Texas at Austin, and where the early seeds of what became this book were developed, first as his dissertation and now this book. And so it's for those of our more seasoned guests of my generation or older who have had the privilege of seeing your former students publish really path-breaking research like this, you know how especially gratifying it is. Before we turn it over to Simon to make a few opening comments on his book, I want to give our listeners, our viewers, a little bit of context for how important this book is. I think that we are at the dawn of what is becoming or what will become a golden era in scholarship on the Reagan administration and 1980s international politics and geopolitics and the end of the Cold War. And there's been some very good work done previously on this, but the reason why this particular moment we're in is so exciting is threefold. First, over the last 10 years, there's been a massive wave of declassification of a lot of Reagan and other, key government national security documents from the 1980s. And so scholars now can view a lot of archival documents and evidence that just wasn't available, 10 years ago or sometimes even 5 years ago. So for any aspiring or early on PhD students in the audience thinking about dissertation subjects, there's some almost endless fertile archival material to be mining on this era. The second is what I would call a diminished partisanship. Now, our current moment, of course, is got very partisan politics, but the 1980s also had deep partisan divisions. Reagan and the Reagan administration inspired very strong feelings and reactions among his supporters and his critics, and that's not always necessarily a bad thing. But strong partisan fevers can sometimes cloud clear analysis. And I'm especially excited to see a younger generation of scholars, exemplified by Simon, who's a real leader here, who came of age after the Reagan years and who had not been affected one way or another, pro or con, by a lot of that partisanship. And that, of course, equips them to take a more dispassionate, objective, balanced view or assessment or reassessment of the policies of that era. And the third factor, in some ways, follows from the second. This is what we might call the passage of geopolitical time. We are now some 3 decades past the peaceful end of the Cold War. We know how history has played out since then. And that, in turn, is a great boon for the historian's perspective. Now that we know how the story ended, how things have played out since, that we can go back now and revisit the early and mid-1980s and discern more clearly what was significant and what was perhaps peripheral in ways that may not have been so evident in the headlines at the time. And so turning to this book, Engaging the Evil Empire, Washington, Moscow, and the Beginnings of the End of the Cold War. The only reference I want to make to my own work is this. I'm currently, as Giovanni mentioned, pretty far along in writing my own history of Reagan administration national security policy. And over the course of that research, I've read several hundred books on the Reagan administration foreign policy. This book is among the 4 or 5 very finest available. This book sets a new standard for a fresh, balanced, insightful take, especially on those critical years of 1980 to 1985. And while there's recently been some very good work produced on the Reagan-Gorbachev relationship, the Reagan second term, kind of 1985 onwards, a criticism of some of those works, rightfully, is that they seem to start in a vacuum. Gorbachev just appears, and then you've got this Reagan-Gorbachev partnership. What happened before that? Where did that come from? Well, as Simon's book shows, that didn't arise in a vacuum, but there are some very important developments in the first Reagan term and particularly during the Andropov and Chernenko time. And so his book is understanding what happened up until the rise of Gorbachev is essential to understanding the Reagan-Gorbachev partnership. And so this book really is a lodestar and a model of international history. Before I get to some of my questions for Simon, let's go ahead and turn it over to you to give us a little bit of a framing on how you put this project together and what some of those important themes are. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Will, and thank you for doing this. It's a real treat to be able to do this together, and my gratitude to Giovanni and Ping at the Duke Center for International and Global Studies, as well as to everyone at the American Grand Strategy Program for making this wonderful event happen. It's really nice to be here with you on what is the official launch date of the book, although it is my understanding that Amazon had very different views on when the book came out than I was given to understand. But that's a happy accident.
Jeff Bezos strikes again.
This book really came out of a puzzle for me, and you elucidated half of that puzzle. How do we get from the so-called death of détente, right? The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan being probably the hallmark of that, but also the ratcheting up of human rights rhetoric by the Carter administration in the late 70s, increased American defense spending in the late 70s, increasing tensions precipitated by a lot of human rights organizations in Eastern Europe in particular. How do we get from the end of détente to kind of one of the textbook cases of old rivals putting aside their differences and finding grounds for cooperation, right? Reagan and Gorbachev, or as Reagan called him, Gorby, and Reagan refers to him as such in his diary, Reagan and Gorby kind of palling around on Red Square. The signature images of the end of the Cold War. And that process, too, is a really fast process, right? One moment, the Cold War is very much there and is kind of this sword of Damocles over international society. And then very quickly, it's not. And I think we're still trying to work through how such a massive transformation could happen. A transformation of the international system, which theretofore had only been brought about by great power war, right? By horrible violence. In this case, happened largely peacefully. And of course, there are episodes of violence in that process, but still, the scale is quite remarkable to me. And my kind of sense of confusion at this change was compounded by two things. It was first that this was allegedly the second Cold War, right? That's the shorthand term for kind of 80 to 85. It's the second Cold War. Nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden, huge things are happening at Geneva, at Reykjavik, etc. And then there's this image of nothing could happen, because in the Soviet Union, all you had were a collection of leaders who were varying degrees of physically incapacitated, unwilling to work with the United States. So that makes it make even less sense to me. And something had to have happened, it seemed to me. Something had to have happened during those intervening 5 years that could bridge those two pretty starkly contrasting periods, but which isn't a part of the so-called conventional wisdom. So I went looking. I went hunting in a few archives. a lot of American and Soviet, now Russian archives, but a lot of other archives too around Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And we can talk more about that if you want to talk about the methodology. And I found three things. There are three major kind of arguments to this book. The first is that the key to understanding the speed and the scope of the changes at the end of the 1980s lies in the beginning of that decade. So this book is very intentionally about 1980 to 1985. I didn't run out of word count. The kind people at Cornell would have probably let me keep going. This book is very intentionally about those first 5 often overlooked years. And the reason for that is because the Cold War balance of power goes from one perceived to favor the Soviet Union, and I emphasize the word perceived, in 1980 to one favoring the United States. And also that the superpower relationship goes from a war of words, that's of course where the evil empire line comes from in the title, but also back channel dialogue, very much not something that's part of our mainstream understanding of this period, to the overt dialogue, the summits, and the summits which are bearing fruit, for example, in 1987 when the INF Treaty is signed. The second big finding of the book is that Ronald Reagan implemented a fairly consistent dual track approach to the Soviet Union, a dual track grand strategy, if you will, which shaped both of those processes I just mentioned. And the two tracks are, to be very brief, on the one hand, the conventional Reagan. That's what he called peace through strength. The arms buildup, the ideological offensive, and the work to build up America's alliance relationships, especially NATO. And the other is a lesser-known Reagan, but it's actually a Reagan that you find a lot in Reagan's own writing about himself, and that's what I call, and he called, quiet diplomacy. Secret back-channel negotiations, in particular with the Soviet Union, designed not only to prevent tensions from boiling over, but also to generate diplomatic momentum, the diplomatic momentum on which the United States would capitalize, in particular during the Gorbachev years, but that was built during the years of Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko. And then finally, I found that the Soviet Union actually has a strategy, right? And as someone who, in large sense, considers himself in equal parts a historian of the United States as well as of the Soviet Union, this was really important to me to highlight. That Moscow is not a passive actor. The Kremlin is actually capable of agency, right? It wasn't all just the Ronald Reagan show. And that approach echoes a lot of the core of Soviet military doctrine, actually, and still Russian military doctrine together today, which was using space to buy time. Or in this context, reducing tensions to create some breathing space so that the Soviet Union could deal with its very serious, increasingly dire domestic economic and political problems without having the additional burden of acute Cold War competition. So that's present over all 4 years. It's not this image of, I try not to present an image of stagnation or the common term of interregnum. Rather, I try to play out this dynamic interchange between Washington and Moscow at the period which I argue is the beginning of the end of the Cold War.
No, a wonderful overview, and I hope that whets the appetite of our listeners and viewers to pick up the book themselves and explore it more in depth. I want to follow up on a number of the different themes and threads that you put out there, and we're also going to come back to some of the research method questions. But first, one of the big thematic ones, structure versus agency. As you know, these are some of the big debates about how and why the Cold War ended the way it did. How much of it was just a function of the structures of the international system, some of the, decaying bipolarity, the American economic resurgence, some of the, sort of internal decline and rot within the Soviet Union. And those who focus more on agency will say, okay, well, that may have been going on, but the choices the individual leaders make, the individual leaders themselves, those really matter. And it was not inevitable that it was going to come out this way. Tell us more about the insights that your book and your research shed on this structure versus agency debate about what really matters in international politics, especially what matters in the Cold War ending the way it did.
So one of my favorite things about being here at Duke and the Stanford School is being in an interdisciplinary department, so I get to work with a lot of really wonderful social scientists. And I think it always kind of frustrates my colleagues from with a social science background when I say, why not both? One of the things I found in this research and also in other work is that different people respond to similar circumstances differently, right? So structure matters because it shapes the context. But also the individual agency of key actors also really matters because they take that information, they orient themselves, and then they take action. And that's shaped by their own personalities, that's shaped by their own personal histories, and of course it's shaped by their context. So Gorbachev is a great example here, where it's not inevitable that he makes the choices that he makes beginning in 1985 to very deliberately try to score diplomatic wins in the form of just doing diplomacy with the United States in order to, one, solidify his own position, which is a lot more precarious for the entire period than I think a lot of us really give credit to. Of course, exemplified by the 91 coup attempt, but it's on thin ice pretty quickly. He could have made very different choices faced with the same circumstances. He could have made the choices, for example, of his mentor, Yuri Andropov, who starts going down that road, but still also puts a lot more focus on sort of state-controlled heavy industry, various economic choices, which Gorbachev eschews in favor of kind of market liberalization reforms. And he could have tried to implement those market liberalization reforms without the perestroika, right? Without the attendant political reforms, glasnost. That didn't have to happen. It was made much more likely to happen by the realities in the Soviet Union at the time. It was made even more likely to happen because Gorbachev at this time had a much better understanding of what the actual circumstances were in the Soviet Union. There's a lot of Politburo members are being lied to make a very long story short about just how dire the circumstances are. And thus, when I look at this structure versus agency debate, I really do see this as a false binary because people are shaped by events around them, circumstances around them, but people are also able to shape those circumstances. And I think what we see in this case is both, is leaders taking action based on what they see, and that's Reagan. That's the story of Reagan, I think, his perception of American weakness. But also his response to that was different to Jimmy Carter's, for example. It was a Reagan response.
Well, and I want to come back to the Reagan response and policies in a little bit. But before that, let's follow up on this structure agency question with two related counterfactuals, which I know you've given a lot of thought to, and you touched on these, but I want to give you a chance to elaborate. So as a thought experiment, let's say that Andropov and or Chernenko had eaten more of their vegetables when they were younger and taken more vitamins and maybe didn't down as much vodka. There was going, let's say either of them had lived longer, had been able to stay in office for a year or two longer, or even, throughout the duration of Reagan's presidency. I mean, if they had the longevity of a Brezhnev, for example, how might things have played out differently?
I think that on the one hand, they both wanted, and they were very vocal about this, they both wanted more overt diplomatic engagement with the United States. Chernenko in particular gets really frustrated that he can't make this happen, in part because of his very serious health problems, and also in part because the Reagan administration is still hesitant to go that far. Take that and amplify that by a factor of 10, and that's Andropov, who because he had been head of the KGB before becoming the general secretary in the Soviet Union, had a really good understanding, probably the best understanding on coming into office of any Soviet leader of this era, of just the nature of the Soviet Union's problems, right? Because Andropov got the raw intelligence, and then he and his team kind of edited it for the consumption of others. But he's getting information like massive scale of defections, just every day, not the famous, double agents, not Oleg Gordievsky or anything like that, just everyday kind of low-ranking KGB folks who get posted to Spain and stop showing up to work. He knows that it's an economic problem, but it's a political problem. And I think he really wants to ameliorate that, but he doesn't have the open-mindedness, I guess I would say, of a Gorbachev. Gorbachev is willing and open to new ideas. He had been one of Andropov's key kind of mentees, I guess we could say. But he has an openness to new ideas, which Andropov doesn't have. I think that comes in large part to do with age. Gorbachev's first job, right? His first job out of university is to travel the countryside and the South Caucasus around Stavropol and explain Khrushchev's secret speech on the Stalin cult to the public. That's his political initiation, right? That's quite something. That sets a real tenor. And also, he has around him some really free-thinking advisors, some of whom have paid professionally. Alexander Yakovlev gets effectively exiled to be ambassador to Canada, which, of course, I think is a really plum position. I'm very biased on this.
As
matter.
A good Canadian, yeah.
I had to get that shout out there, right?
Okay.
He effectively gets exiled for holding some of these views. Gorbachev brings him in. And he's willing to, because he has a sense of security that I think no one in the Soviet Union who lived through, in particular, the dawn of World War II on Soviet territory, right? The beginning of Operation Barbarossa leaves a really indelible mark. And they write about this, about never wanting to be caught flat-footed and surprised again. Gorbachev's policies perhaps invite some of that to a much greater extent than I think any Soviet leader would have been. So similar thrust, but I think a lot of the specifics, you would look at very different approaches.
Okay. Well, I want to now switch gears and look a little bit more at Ronald Reagan and pick up on, you had earlier mentioned a big part of your argument is what you see as a certain consistency in Reagan's dual track strategy of pressure and engagement, or pressure and outreach. And of course, as you know very well, there are endless and ongoing and very interesting debates about, did Reagan have a consistent strategy? Was there a quote-unquote Reagan reversal where he's the hardliner up through 1983 and then the more accommodationist afterwards? Or, as our mutual friend and a fantastic scholar, James Graham Wilson, has argued, was there more improvisation than a big grand strategic vision? So a two-part question. First, tell us a little bit more about where you situate yourself in these debates about, was Reagan consistent or changing course? And then second, any broader takeaways from your book, especially since you teach at a policy school, our audience is interested in policy and strategy. Any takeaways from your book for thinking about grand strategy as a principle?
So this is a question that I often think about because I teach strategy, right? I can see some of my students from the American Grand Strategy course here with us now.
Give them some extra credit. So be a generous.
Yes, I know who is here.
Okay.
And I don't view evolution as necessarily meaning that there is no plan, right? And strategy, to me, especially grand strategy, when you're really talking about all levels of national power, must be responsive to changing realities, or at least in order to be good, I think it needs to be responsive to changing realities. And it also needs to contain various tools, right? A strategy, I had a piece in Foreign Policy a while ago, for example, about Iran, where I argued that a policy of just sort of beating the Iranians over the head with harsh rhetoric isn't really going to do anything. Might score you some political points, but it's not really going to affect the kind of change that I think a lot of people want to. Reagan, I think, understood this, and so I fall much more in the consistency camp. Not to say that he basically wrote a plan and then never deviated, but rather in my research, I did a lot of reading of Reagan's earlier works, especially pre-presidential work, and even when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, he had to do a lot
in the 40s and 50s. Yeah.
Yes, a long time ago, but he had to do a lot of negotiating. And when he was GE, General Electric's kind of spokesman at large, he ruminates a lot on carrots and sticks. And that's how I make sense of American strategy under Reagan towards the Soviet Union, is it's one of carrots and sticks. So you have the massive defense buildup. You have the really harsh ideological rhetoric, though I would emphasize that the Soviets gave as good as they got on that front, including frequent comparisons of the president to Adolf Hitler in the press,
which they didn't mean as a compliment.
Yes, which was not meant as a compliment. So that's the stick part, right? But then you go to the negotiating table. Whether that negotiating table is a back room in an embassy in Berlin that no one really knows anything is happening at, or whether that's the Geneva summit and the Aga Khan's lakefront villa in much more sumptuous surroundings, when you go to the negotiating table, you actually have something you can trade. But you've also established the idea in your interlocutors that you're actually willing to trade. Right, so it's not seen as just a rhetorical exercise, just a point-scoring exercise. I think this is the big takeaway from Reagan's strategy today, is that as it was conceived of then, one, it was responsive to changing realities and changing perspectives. That's why there's a lot less of the ideological stuff near the end and a lot more of the overt engagement. But it also backed diplomacy with force and power and credibility. Both the credibility that you were a good faith interlocutor, but also that you would abandon the effort if it wasn't working out, and also that you didn't rely on diplomacy in order to kind of keep your head above the water. That's Gorbachev's problem, especially at the end, is that diplomacy is kind of all he's got at home and abroad. And so he needs to make some pretty striking concessions.
Very helpful, and that's why I think you've really benefited from some of the more recently declassified Reagan administration documents as well, and I think that certainly reinforces a lot of the findings I've had too. Let's talk about a couple of other important people and episodes from this time. And even though over the course of your book you're working with three different Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, there's also another important Soviet who transcends those three, and that's Foreign Minister Gromyko. Tell us a little bit more about what you learned about Gromyko, what role he plays in your argument, any ways that maybe your assessments of him changed over the course of your research.
So Gromyko is often referred to, I guess I wouldn't say affectionately, as Mr. Niet. Right? That's all he did was say no. And he certainly is emblematic of what's referred to as the gerontocracy in the Kremlin, right? It's the early 80s. He's been in his job since the 1950s.
Yeah.
And there's no arguing.
The Soviet version of a tenured professor, right?
Yes. There's no arguing with that fact. But at the same time, I found that he was a much more active and engaged participant in a lot of these processes than we think of. On the one hand, Gorbachev removes him from his post with a promotion, a nominal promotion. It's a de jure promotion. It's not really a de facto promotion to be the head of the Supreme Soviet, which is allegedly the highest decision-making body in the Soviet Union, but is actually a very gilded rubber stamp. So Gorbachev feels that he needs to get Gromyko out. So in a sense, Gorbachev kind of misjudges him in a same way as I had. But when I look through his role in some of the earlier negotiation, he seems to be a lot more of a constructive player throughout a lot of this. I think in part because he recognizes the problems, but that constructiveness was modulated by bureaucratic infighting. So he's often not constructive, not because he's not even on the record as endorsing this, but rather because it's part of a Kremlin power play. And one of the things that I really love being able to show in this book is that there are, of course, vivid stories about the bureaucratic infighting in the Reagan administration, as there are in basically every American administration.
Yeah, but Weinberger versus Schultz. Yeah, against everybody.
Classic fights. It was really fun, including a lot using Gromyko to illustrate just how that's playing out in the Kremlin too. That this is not a black box. This isn't a monolith. This is an area where people are really having heated fights over policy.
All right, and speaking of fights over policy, let's shift now and talk about your findings and where the role of SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, fits into your argument. And of course, as hopefully at least some of our listeners and viewers know, SDI becomes very important in the Reagan-Gorbachev relationship, and it's kind of the main sticking point that stops them from sort of a final grand bargain at Reykjavik in '86. But as you certainly show in here, pretty early on, certainly in 1984, the Soviets are already worried about SDI. No one quite knows if this thing could actually be real or not, but the mere notion of it is certainly at least getting the Kremlin's attention somewhat. So tell us a little bit more about your findings on SDI and the role that it plays in these years up until Gorbachev.
So SDI is, just from a policy perspective, is fascinating because of how few of the very top leadership in the Reagan White House knows about it before it's unveiled by the president on TV. Including, for example, you mentioned George Shultz, who basically finds out about this at the same time as everyone does. SDI is, of course, this sort of fantastic sci-fi anti-ballistic missile defense system, brilliant pebbles and space-based lasers. I mean, it earns its moniker of Star Wars justly. But as it was perceived in the Soviet Union, this was kind of the apex of the leveraging of American technological know-how and economic power in order to undermine something that the Soviet Union did have an undeniable advantage in, which was kind of mass.
Yeah.
Right? This is the era of kind of throw weight, which is kind of the actuarial sort of term for how many missiles a side could get into the air and into space. And the Soviet Union has an advantage in that. And it's a hard-won advantage. This seemed to Soviet policymakers that it could wipe out those capabilities, not necessarily overnight, but really put them into jeopardy. And when we talk about this capability to kind of absorb a Soviet attack, whether that's retaliatory or a preemptive strike, of course, they mostly thought about it in the context of retaliatory. It has to be mentioned in the context of all of the other things the Reagan administration is doing, right? So you have an administration which is building highly miniaturized, highly accurate nuclear weapons in the MX missile, the Trident D5 submarine-launched missile, that's building a stealth bomber, which can maybe deliver nuclear payloads undetected in a decapitation strike, that's fielding new, more capable intermediate range nuclear weapons in Western Europe, which don't extend all the way to Moscow, but have all of Eastern Europe in their range. And then it's talking about fielding something that can prevent Soviet retaliation, totally undoing mutually assured destruction. It looks a lot like a plan to fight a nuclear war.
Yeah.
it looks a lot like a plan to fight a nuclear war. And then you have Reagan's rhetoric. Then you have some unfortunate hot mic incidents about, we'll start the bombing in 5 minutes, which, no one in Moscow takes seriously. So SDI creates a lot of a strain on the Soviet leadership, in part because they know that they don't have it in them to match this capability economically. And also there are serious technological problems. There's not a lot of liquid cash sitting around, especially not foreign currency, which would be needed to get some of the equipment to make something like this happen. Yeah. So they then either have to kind of compete in this really quixotic way, or they need to concede defeat. And neither of those is exactly appealing to Soviet policymakers. So I know some people I think it's possible to overstate the importance of SDI, but situated in the context of everything else that the administration is doing, and it's one more really powerful pressure point. And of course, Reagan says, well, we'll share it with you. And I think he was actually quite sincere on this. I think he sincerely wanted to rid the world of nuclear weapons. But why on earth would any Soviet leader believe him? I think it's Shevardnadze, or maybe it's Gorbachev himself. Shevardnadze is Gorbachev's foreign minister after Gromyko's removed. It says, you won't share milking technology with us. Why on earth would we believe that you'll share the technology to shoot down ballistic missiles? Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So it's a really important point of, I think, strain and leverage that the United States has. And because it's not really anything yet, it's a great bargaining chip, right? If we want to kind of keep the chip metaphor going, it doesn't have a dollar value written on it.
Yeah.
You're kind of both guessing and playing this game about what its value is, and that turned out to be a winning proposition for the United States.
Another question, and this is going to be following up on that theme about Soviet fears of, an American first strike and Soviet vulnerabilities. By the way, let me say to our viewers and listeners, if you do have any questions, we're going to be turning to those in a minute. So please do feel free to type any of those into the chat room. Simon, let's focus on a very particular episode in your book, the Able Archer crisis. For our listeners, I'll let Simon, before you explain your findings on that, give them a quick little background on what it actually was. But going back to the significance of your book, you are the first, or certainly one of the very first scholars to have a pretty strongly revisionist take on what actually happened or didn't happen with Able Archer and how much it mattered or not. And, for that reason alone, because it's become so iconic, 2 books just on the Able Archer crisis came out in the last year that were bestsellers, and you've got a pretty different take. So please tell us what it was, and then tell us how your archival discoveries may differ from what a lot of the conventional wisdom was.
Gladly. So the conventional story about Able Archer is that it's when the so-called Second Cold War almost turned hot. November 1983, NATO is running a command post exercise, kind of rehearsing the motions of starting a nuclear war, using intermediate range nuclear weapons to repel a Soviet attack through the famous Fulda Gap. So the conventional story is that the Soviets watched this happen and persuaded themselves that this was actually cover, that this exercise was cover for a nuclear surprise attack. That, when the allegedly fake big red button was pushed, it would actually be the real thing. And key to this story is actually a fellow I mentioned earlier, who's Oleg Gordievsky, who was a KGB officer stationed in the Soviet embassy in London, who kind of breaks this story. It's a great story.
He breaks it in terms of sharing.
In terms of he reveals it to the British. He reveals it to his British handlers, and then they say, "Oh my gosh, we got to the within a breath of nuclear war as the Soviets contemplated a preemptive strike." Mm-hmm. It's a great Cold War story, right? Spies, missiles in dark German forests, a whole element that has to do with supercomputers and cybernetics, which we probably don't have time to get into now, but which is a lot of fun. What I found, and mostly in my research for this book, primarily in the East German and the Czechoslovak military and intelligence archives in Freiburg and Berlin and Prague was a very different story. What I found, and I should mention that these two countries, intelligence agencies, the Stasi and the STB in East Germany and Czechoslovakia, respectively, were actually the lead monitors of what was going on. And so I find, by contrast, a very sanguine approach to what's going on. In fact, a lot of comments from very senior intelligence officials saying, we know this is just an exercise. We know that they're just going through the motions. This is all framed in much more ideological language, but it's pretty straightforward what they're saying in Prague and East Berlin and what they're reporting to Moscow. And that really struck me, because I started this project an Able Archer kind of believer. Right. Yeah. What I was really excited to do was to explain how it could get this bad, and yet they still got over it. So at first I was a little bit let down, but then I was really excited because to me it showed the promise and the real wealth of information in these archives. Then I started chasing this question down in Moscow, in Kyiv, in some really wonderful interviews and oral histories conducted with very senior military policymakers. And I found that while there was some pretty routine Soviet, I guess we could call it counter-mobilization, and this is normal during large-scale military exercises, just to show the other side, we're watching, we're aware. All of these top Soviet policymakers are very derisive of the idea that things ever came to the brink of nuclear war. In fact, they're saying, no, we knew this was just another exercise, and we responded accordingly, but we didn't really take seriously any of these ideas that there was a real threat of nuclear war. So a very different story to the one that's conventionally told. In some ways, it's maybe not as good a story. It doesn't have the emotional charge that maybe anyone listening or watching has seen the show Deutschland 83, which is kind of all about this. It's a great show, but it presents a different account. But it's also a reassuring account, if I would say, that both countries, both superpowers and also their allies, took seriously the responsibility of kind of nuclear stewardship, if you will, and that even during a time when a lot of heated words were being exchanged, that they were able to disaggregate rhetoric and reality, and that's comforting, to me, especially in our present moment.
And for all of us scholars, young and old alike, this is a great case study in being open to new evidence, changing our mind and changing our assumptions. I like that you said you had started the project as more of a believer in the conventional story that Able Archer was this, near nuclear crisis, the closest we came to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then finding actually, the evidence points otherwise. And so let's be open to a reinterpretation there. Let me follow up with one more from me, which you alluded to, and we're now shifting a little bit more into historical method and archives. Tell us more. Of course, it helps that you've got some pretty remarkable linguistic gifts and know several languages. Tell us more about what was involved in digging around in historical archives in East Berlin and Prague to find out what was going on in Moscow and Washington.
Yeah, well, I was in more ways than I could ever enumerate, extraordinarily fortunate and know a great deal to my parents. But I was really lucky that not only did they encourage me to a love of language, I was raised in a household where a lot of languages were spoken, so I was able to tap a lot of sources for this work. I should preface my answer by saying that what you can get right now in Moscow in the archives would blow your mind. The quantity of material which has been re-declassified by the current regime in Russia, which is not one which we would think has a big kind of openness and transparency bent, is pretty extraordinary. And these are materials which were open maybe in the very early 90s, were closed off again by the Yeltsin administration, and are now coming back out. So when I say a lot of this, I don't want to give the impression that this is what you need to do in order to get anything out of Moscow. There's actually a ton there. But if you also pay a visit to Berlin, Prague, I got some really wonderful material in Kyiv, Ukraine, where everything from the communist period has been completely declassified, and that's also true throughout the Eastern Bloc, for the most part, with the exception of some intelligence materials, not so much foreign intelligence materials. I kind of like to talk about it as a backdoor, right? So if the Warsaw Pact was, let's say, not an equitable arrangement amongst all of its members, even if you want to exercise control over your partners, you need to tell them what to say, right? You need to explain things to them. And thus, a lot of really sensitive documents, which are not yet fully declassified in Russia, exist on the recipient end in Berlin, in Prague, because this needed to be laid out. The line needed to be laid out, and it was often hotly debated, for example, at the upper echelons of Warsaw Pact leadership at the Political Consultative Committee, and it was really hashed out. And you see some figures like Enver Hoxha of Albania, Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania, really fight back against what the Soviets are saying. But through those archives, you can get an amazing picture into what is going on in Moscow. So I could talk about this for a very long time, but I want to tell you just one example. And you teed up the Able Archer point. So we have this kind of image of two administrations that are never talking, right? In the first half of the 80s in particular. And by really pure chance, in the East German Communist Party archives in Berlin, I came across a treasure trove of memoranda of conversation of secret back channel negotiations, which were taking place in Berlin between the U.S. ambassador to West Germany, was a guy called Arthur Burns, and the Soviet ambassadors to East Germany. There's a couple during this period, two very senior postings. This is the kind of diplomatic A-team whom you're sending to those jobs, but also who have a pretext to meet, because they're I think the official term is co-allied military governors of Berlin. So they have a reason to meet. It doesn't incur any interest, because usually when they meet, it's about, okay, well, we're supposed to only fly 17 aircraft through the corridor, and we'd like to fly 18, please. Okay, stamp, move on. Burns, Reagan's appointee, sits down and he says, Ronald Reagan sent me here to use this as a means of keeping the Cold War under control, as a means of opening dialogue in a kind of a very non-ideological manner. In fact, Burns says something truly extraordinary in 1983, where he says his Soviet interlocutor, Vyacheslav Kochemasov, is complaining, Reagan keeps on saying these very unkind things about us. And Burns says, you must think about this in the context of a parent becoming irate and lashing out verbally at a child whom they love. That's not the conventional image of Ronald Reagan, loving father to the Soviet Union. I mean, he was. Yeah. These exist only because the East Germans got copies. So the versions I found, they were translated from the Russian into the German. But they're a wonderful insight into a little known aspect of the totality of the Cold War, right? That really cuts against this grain of Second Cold War confrontation clash, but actually shows how Reagan is really deftly using carrot and stick in order to achieve the results that he wants for U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union. So that's just a little idea of what you can do. There's a lot more to be said for the Eastern European archives, but I've probably already said too much.
But although I hope that wets the appetite again of some of the other graduate students and scholars on the call to realize just the almost infinite new findings available in those archives, and why we really need as many pieces as possible from as many vantage points to come as close as we can to the full picture.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.